There is one question that anthropologists still refuse to answer directly. Picture the canyon at dusk, mile-high walls turning the color of embers, a creek running turquoise through the shadow at the bottom, cutting a path so old that the rock around it remembers seas that no longer exist. Somewhere above, on a rim most Americans of the era had never seen with their own eyes, a handful of outsiders were making their way down an 8-mile trail on muleback, notebooks in their saddlebags, toward a village few maps even bothered to mark. In the 1890s, in a canyon so remote that mules were the only way in, this small group of researchers sat down with the people of Havasu Canyon and asked them where they came from. The answer was not a legend about the sky. It was not a story about crossing an ocean or walking down from the north or descending from the stars. It was a story about going down, down through rock, down through darkness, down into a world that, according to the people who told it, still exists beneath the floor of the Grand Canyon. The transcript survives. So does the confusion of the men who wrote it down. Because what the Havasupai described was not myth in the way the word is usually used. It was testimony, delivered as fact, passed from elder to elder for longer than anyone could count, and repeated to outsiders with a kind of patience that suggested the story had been told and doubted many times before. The question that follows has never fully gone away. What if the Grand Canyon's most famous mystery was never a rumor from 1909? What if it started here, decades earlier, in the mouths of the people who had lived beside the canyon the longest? To understand the testimony, you first have to understand who gave it. The Havasupai, Havasu Baja, the people of the blue-green water, have lived in a side canyon of the Grand Canyon for at least 8 centuries, likely longer. Their village, Supai, sits at the bottom of an 8-mile trail carved into sandstone, beside a creek so saturated with dissolved limestone that it runs the color of turquoise glass. It is one of the most isolated communities in the continental United States. Even today, mail is delivered by mule train, the last such route in the country. In the late 19th century, that isolation made the Havasupai a subject of fascination for a new generation of American ethnographers. The federal government was cataloguing native nations at a rapid pace, sending surveyors, geologists, and anthropologists into the Southwest to record languages, kinship systems, and origin narratives before those traditions were lost. It was in this window, the 1880s and 1890s, that Havasupai origin accounts were first written down by outsiders in any systematic way. And what they wrote down did not sound like the tidy migration stories being collected elsewhere. It sounded like a description of a place. According to the accounts recorded in this period, the Havasupai did not simply believe in an underworld the way a modern reader might imagine, a symbolic afterlife, a spiritual metaphor. They described an emergence, a physical passage of the first people upward out of a lower world into the canyon they now called home. A passage sometimes described as a reed, sometimes as a narrow crack in stone through which the first beings climbed. A flood that had once filled the canyon from rim to rim, forcing the ancestors to seek higher ground before a deity carved a channel to drain the water away. Picture the scene the story describes, water rising against sheer, red walls a mile high, no shore to reach, no direction left but up. And below, all of it hidden beneath the flood, the opening the first people had climbed out of, sealed again, they said, so nothing could follow them out of the dark. That single detail, a sealed opening deliberately closed, is the kind of specific, physical claim that does not usually survive in symbolic folklore. Symbols stay vague. This did not. To modern ears, this sounds like myth, but hold that thought, because in a few minutes you are going to see exactly what was hiding under that canyon floor, and why scientists, not storytellers, were the ones who confirmed it. To the ethnographers recording it, something stood out immediately. This was not an isolated story. Emergence narratives, worlds beneath worlds, ancestors climbing upward through the earth, appear across dozens of unrelated native nations throughout the American Southwest, from the Hopi mesas to the Pueblo villages of the Rio Grande. Which raised an uncomfortable question, one that still has no clean answer. Why did so many unconnected peoples, speaking unrelated languages, separated by hundreds of miles of desert, describe the same basic architecture of creation? A world below, a passage up, a flood that once filled the canyon. Coincidence explains some of it. Shared environment explains more, but it does not explain all of it. And the ethnographers who first wrote these stories down said so themselves, in the margins of their own notebooks. Here is where the story stops being only a story, because the Grand Canyon is not solid rock. It never was. Roughly a third of the way up the canyon wall sits a formation called the Red Wall Limestone. Nearly 500 feet of stone laid down when this part of Arizona was the floor of a shallow tropical sea, more than 300 million years ago. Limestone dissolves. Water finds cracks in it and widens them, over centuries, into passages, and passages into caverns. The Grand Canyon is riddled with these caves. Geologists estimate there may be over 1,000 of them, and to this day only a small fraction have been formally surveyed. Some are barely large enough for a person to crawl through. Others open into chambers the size of cathedrals, with ceilings lost in darkness even to headlamp beams. Cavers who have mapped the accessible sections describe passages that narrow to a crawl and then, without warning, drop into rooms where the air is still and cold and has not moved in centuries. Water drips somewhere unseen. Formations grow from the ceiling in shapes that took tens of thousands of years to form, one mineral drop at a time. Geologists call this kind of terrain karst, a landscape sculpted from the inside out, where the visible surface is only a thin shell over a hidden architecture of tunnels, sinkholes, and chambers. The Grand Canyon's karst system is considered one of the most extensive and least understood in North America, and researchers publishing in speleological journals as recently as the past 2 decades have continued to describe entire sections of the canyon's cave network as functionally unexplored. This is the landscape the Havasupai were describing in the 1890s, not metaphorically, physically. One of them changed the entire conversation. In 1933, a river guide exploring a cave roughly 200 feet above the Colorado River found something that should not have been there. Wooden figurines, split willow twigs, bent and folded into the shape of animals, deer, bighorn sheep, no larger than a human hand. They were later radiocarbon-dated, and this is the number that stopped researchers cold. The oldest were determined to be over 4,000 years old, placed in that cave by human hands nearly 2,000 years before the pyramids of Giza were built. Stanton's cave, as it came to be known, also produced the remains of extinct Ice Age animals, teratons, giant condor-like birds with wingspans over 11 feet, species that vanished from North America thousands of years before written history began anywhere on Earth. The cave had been sealed for millennia, untouched. A capsule. Later excavations at the same site, conducted through the 1960s and 1970s by teams working with the Museum of Northern Arizona, uncovered nearly 100 more figurines, along with fragments of split twig objects that appeared to have been ceremonially broken before being placed in the dark. A detail archaeologists still debate the meaning of: deliberate breakage, deliberate concealment, a ritual whose purpose has never been recovered, and it was only one cave of more than 1,000. Suddenly, the Havasupai testimony from the 1890s looked less like folklore and more like something else entirely, a memory, encoded in narrative form of a landscape whose real subterranean geography nobody outside the canyon fully understood yet. But the deeper this goes, the stranger it gets, because in a few minutes you're going to see how one newspaper story in 1909 nearly buried this entire testimony under a lie, and how that lie is still spreading today. By the early 20th century, serious researchers were paying closer attention. Naturalist and writer George Wharton James, who spent extensive time among the Havasupai around the turn of the century, documented their reverence for specific canyon locations, places treated not as scenery, but as thresholds, sites where the membrane between the upper world and the one below was said to be thin. Later, in the 1920s, the ethnographer Leslie Spear conducted the most exhaustive academic study of Havasupai culture ever undertaken, spending months living among them and recording their cosmology in detail that finally gave outside researchers a fuller picture of what the 1890s accounts had only sketched. What Spear's work confirmed was this: the emergence narrative was not a peripheral folk tale. It was central. It explained the canyon's shape, the location of sacred springs, the reason certain caves were forbidden to enter, and the origin of the Havasupai people themselves. It was, in the fullest sense of the word, their history. Spear noted something else almost in passing that later researchers would return to again and again. The Havasupai did not treat every cave in the canyon the same way. Certain caves were spoken of freely. Others were named only in low voices, if at all, and children were warned away from them long before they were old enough to ask why. When Speer pressed for explanations, the answers were consistent but sparse. Those places belonged to what came before, and what came before was not something the living were meant to disturb. A prohibition like that does not usually attach itself to nothing. It attaches itself to something a people has decided across many generations is worth protecting. And history, unlike myth, tends to leave physical evidence behind. Then, in 1909, something happened that would permanently entangle the real Havasupai testimony with a very different kind of story. A local Arizona newspaper published a sensational article claiming that an explorer, funded by the Smithsonian Institution, had discovered a vast underground citadel deep within the canyon. Carved chambers, mummified remains, artifacts described as Egyptian and Tibetan in style, and a civilization of unknown origin. The story spread. It still spreads today, cited endlessly online as proof of a hidden civilization beneath the canyon. A search for the phrase Grand Canyon Underground City returns thousands of pages, most of them repeating the same uncredited 1909 text, as though it were an established archaeological record rather than a single unverified newspaper column. Park rangers at Grand Canyon National Park report fielding questions about the hidden Egyptian tunnels so frequently that the Park Service has published a formal statement addressing it, confirming plainly that no such discovery has ever been documented, filed, or verified by any recognized institution. It is a strange kind of afterlife for a story built entirely out of nothing, more durable in some ways than most confirmed archaeological finds ever become. And it is precisely that durability that has made it so difficult for the real, documented testimony underneath it to be heard on its own terms. But researchers who have gone looking for the underlying facts have found none. No expedition records, no Smithsonian archive, no trace of the explorer in the institution's personnel files. The Smithsonian itself has repeatedly stated it holds no evidence such a discovery ever took place, and no professional archaeologist has ever located the cave described in the article. The consensus among historians is that the 1909 story was very likely fabricated, a piece of imaginative frontier journalism dressed up as fact, published in an era when sensational newspaper hoaxes were common and rarely corrected. It is important to separate this clearly from what came before it. The Havasupai testimony recorded in the 1890s was not about Egyptian mummies. It was not about a lost race of unknown origin. It described something older, quieter, and rooted entirely in Havasupai cosmology, an emergence from below, not an invasion of foreigners from below. The 1909 hoax borrowed the shape of an older, real tradition, a world beneath the canyon, and dressed it in the imagery of a very different era's obsessions. It is arguably the reason the authentic testimony survives as widely as it does today, tangled up with a story that was never true, which leaves the actual mystery standing exactly where it was before the hoax arrived, untouched, and still, more than a century later, unexplained, waiting, like the caves themselves, for someone willing to go back in. Because once you strip the hoax away completely, what is left underneath it is, in some ways, even harder to dismiss. Stay with this. The next part is where the evidence stops fitting the easy explanations. Strip away the fabricated 1909 story entirely, and what remains is still strange. You are left with a documented pre-1900 oral tradition describing an underworld beneath the canyon, a flood that once filled it, and an emergence passage, recorded by multiple independent observers among a people who had never left the region and had no access to the geological surveys that would later confirm the canyon's extensive cave systems. You are left with a landscape that genuinely contains more than 1,000 caves, most still unmapped. You are left with at least one of those caves proven through radiocarbon dating to have been used by human beings for ritual purposes over 4,000 years ago. Objects deliberately placed, deliberately hidden in total darkness for reasons no modern researcher can fully reconstruct. And you are left with a pattern of emergence mythology repeating itself with uncanny structural similarity across dozens of native nations who had no shared written language and limited contact with one another. Mainstream anthropology has an explanation for each piece individually. Split twig figurines are generally interpreted as hunting magic, ritual objects meant to ensure success before a hunt, a practice with parallels in cultures worldwide. Emergence myths are understood as a near-universal narrative structure appearing wherever peoples reflect on the relationship between the earth and the origin of life. The caves are simply caves, geology, doing what limestone does when water is patient enough. Each explanation taken alone is reasonable, but taken together they start to strain. Because the figurines were not scattered randomly through the canyon's cave system. They cluster in a specific handful of caves, high, difficult to reach, chosen with apparent intention rather than convenience. Whoever placed them climbed hundreds of feet up sheer limestone in darkness, carrying fragile woven objects, for a purpose that had nothing to do with practicality. That is not the behavior of people leaving something behind by accident. That is the behavior of people marking a place they believed mattered, the same way a modern visitor might leave a candle at a shrine, not because the shrine requires it, but because the act of leaving something behind is itself the point. The overlap is not proof of anything supernatural. No serious researcher claims that it is, but it is, at minimum, a coincidence stacked on top of other coincidences, in a place already saturated with testimony about what lies beneath it. What none of them fully accounts for is the specificity of the Havasupai account when set against the canyon's actual, later confirmed subterranean geography, nor why a landscape this thoroughly mythologized as hollow has never been comprehensively explored, even now, more than a century after the testimony was first written down. The National Park Service itself has closed many of the canyon's deeper caves to the public, citing preservation of fragile ecosystems and, in several documented cases, the presence of Native American cultural material that has never been fully catalogued, which means, quite literally, that parts of the canyon the Havasupai spoke of in the 1890s remain closed to investigation today. Not because nothing is there, but because something is. Permits to enter the restricted caves are granted rarely and almost always to credentialed research teams working in direct coordination with tribal representatives. Even then, access is often limited to the cave entrance, with deeper chambers left undisturbed at the request of the nations whose ancestors are believed to have used them. It is a strange position for modern archaeology to be in, standing at the threshold of a landscape it has the tools to explore, and choosing, deliberately, not to go further. What began as a single origin story told by one small nation in one hidden canyon expands the further you look. Add the Hopi, whose own emergence tradition describes ancestors climbing from a lower world through a sipapu, a ceremonial opening in the earth still symbolically present in every kiva built across the southwest today. Add the layered flood narratives that appear independently throughout Puebloan cultures stretching from Arizona into New Mexico. Add the confirmed, dated presence of human ritual activity inside actual canyon caves stretching back thousands of years before any written record on the continent. Add the Zuni, whose own migration narrative describes ancestors emerging into a world of unbearable light after generations spent in darkness below, forced upward level by level, until the surface finally proved survivable. Add the Navajo, whose traditions describe not one underworld, but four, each a distinct stage of ascent, each associated with its own trials, before the people reached the present world at last. None of these nations share a language family with the Havasupai. None of them are known to have exchanged this specific narrative with one another through trade or contact. And yet the underlying architecture, descent, darkness, ascent, emergence into light, repeats with a consistency that pure coincidence struggles to fully carry. Add a canyon system so vast and so honeycombed with unexplored limestone passages that the United States Geological Survey itself admits full subterranean mapping has never been completed. What looks, at first glance, like one isolated piece of 1890s ethnography becomes something considerably larger, not proof, but a pattern a regional pattern of testimony about a hollow landscape, corroborated by a hollow landscape that genuinely exists. And that pattern leads to one final, unavoidable question. No archaeologist has found a lost civilization beneath the Grand Canyon. That claim belongs to a 1909 newspaper hoax, and it should stay there. But no anthropologist has ever fully explained why the Havasupai, decades before science confirmed the canyon's true subterranean scale, described their own origin as an emergence from below, through rock, out of darkness, into the light of the canyon they still call home. They did not know in the 1890s that their canyon concealed more than 1,000 caves. They did not know that human hands had left ritual offerings in the darkness of those caves 4,000 years before anyone wrote the story down. They said it anyway, with certainty, as history, not fable. Somewhere in that canyon tonight, in a cave no trail leads to, the dark is exactly as complete as it was 4,000 years ago. The figurines that survive are sealed behind glass in a museum case, hundreds of miles from the silence they were taken out of. The caves that have not been surveyed remain exactly as unmapped as they were when the first ethnographer closed his notebook and rode back up the trail, unsure of what he had just been told. The land, it turns out, was hollow in exactly the way they said it was. The civilization was never there. The testimony was,